As we return home from on the ground in Israel, the war is escalating. Israel has said that it is expanding its ground operations in Gaza, where for many hours, electricity and communication lines were reported snapped. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story, as we continue to look at the geopolitical ramifications of what is unfolding in Israel's retaliation for the Hamas terror attack. India has chosen to abstain from a United Nations vote that was seeking to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution went through, ironically, even as Gaza was being pounded by the Israeli Air Force jets. However, India has argued that the reason it chose to abstain from this particular resolution was because the resolution did not mention Hamas and the terror attack of October 7th. In fact, India backed a Canada-led amendment to this resolution that spoke about not just a ceasefire, but also a reference to the Hamas terror attack. That consensus could not be created. And finally, the resolution that was voted on, eventually abstained on by India, did not find a reference to Hamas, and therefore India did not support it. The landslide resolution went through, but so did the bombardment of Gaza, where ground troops of the Israeli military have now expanded their operations. This has also led to a political slugfest at home. Priyanka Gandhi of the Congress said she was ashamed of the position that India had taken, arguing that it undid everything that India stood for. To understand India's decision at the United Nations, but also the seeming irrelevance of what the United Nations does and asks for, let's introduce our panel of experts on the program today. Joining us is Strategic Affairs Editor at The Hindu, Suhasini Haidar. Always a pleasure, Suhasini. Also joining us is military veteran General Raj Shukla. Welcome to the program, sir. Also joining us is veteran diplomat Ambassador Dilip Sinha. And also joining us is Dr. Tara Kartha, Strategic Affairs Analyst. Welcome all of you to the program. Let me play out in full first India's rather nuanced intervention at the United Nations, being criticized by the political opposition for a failure to take a moral position. But India calling for de-escalation in those comments. Listen in before we open the debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a world where differences and disputes should be resolved by dialogue, this august body should be deeply concerned at recourse to violence. That too, when it happens on a scale and intensity that is an affront to basic human values. Violence as a means to achieve political objectives damages indiscriminately and does not pave the way for any durable solutions. The terror attacks in Israel on 7th October were shocking and deserve condemnation. Our thoughts are also with those taken hostages. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. Terrorism is a malignancy and knows no borders, nationality, or race. The world should not buy into any justification of terror acts. Let us keep aside differences, unite, and adopt a zero-tolerance approach to terrorism. Mr. President, casualties in the ongoing conflict in Gaza are a telling, serious, and continuing concern. Civilians, especially women and children, are paying with their lives. This humanitarian crisis needs to be addressed. We welcome the international community's de-escalation efforts and delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. India, too, has contributed to this effort. Mr. President, India is deeply concerned at the deteriorating security situation and astounding loss of civilian lives in the ongoing conflict. The escalation of hostilities in the region will only exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. It is necessary for all parties to display the utmost responsibility. Mr. President, India has always supported a negotiated two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine issue, leading to the establishment of a sovereign, independent, and viable state of Palestine, living within secure and recognized borders side by side in peace with Israel. For this, we urge the parties to de-escalate, eschew violence, and work towards creating conditions for an early resumption of direct peace negotiations. We hope that the deliberations of this Assembly will send a clear message against terror and violence and expand prospects for diplomacy and dialogue while addressing the humanitarian crisis that confronts us. I thank you.
As that statement was being made by India and other countries, Gaza was being bombarded through the night. Gaza was bombarded. Internet and communication lines were snapped. Several aid agencies, including the World Health Organization, said it could not reach its staff on the ground. The latest casualty figures: 1,400 Israelis have been killed. 222, including citizens from other countries, are still in the captivity of Hamas. Palestinian officials say that more than 7,000 Palestinians have been killed, and 2,900 of those are children. That catastrophic casualty figure is bound to increase as Israel proceeds with its frontal assault. I want to get reactions on the Indian position. The opposition alleging that India has missed a moral moment. Ambassador Sinha, India did call out terrorism unequivocally, but also asked for de-escalation. The resolution, which was drafted by Jordan, went through in a landslide win, but did not mention the Hamas terror attack. Do you think India should have voted for it nevertheless?
Well, I think India's vote is broadly correct, because this round of violence has started because of one specific act, a terrorist act of Hamas. It was a brutal act, and had it not happened, this round of violence at least would not have taken place and would not have escalated to this point. So for a resolution not to mention the Hamas attack and to condemn that is, I think, incorrect. One cannot equate the two. Hamas was the terrorist attacker in this. It carried out a brutal attack, and that should be condemned by the General Assembly. I feel that the Brazilian resolution that had been introduced first in the Security Council and which was supported by, among others, the UAE, was a very good resolution because it condemned the terrorist attack. It called for an immediate release of all hostages, which again, this Jordanian resolution does not entirely, I think, clearly state. And it is interesting to note that at least this resolution was introduced by Jordan on behalf of the Arab League, but at least one member of the Arab League, Tunisia, also abstained. So there was some hesitation even among members that are traditionally with Palestine and support Palestine on the manner in which this resolution seemed to gloss over the terrorist attack.
So in general, you believe that India took a reasonably nuanced position, calling out terrorism, but also asking for de-escalation, but that India could not have and should not have voted for a resolution that made zero reference to Hamas. Ambassador Sinha?
Yes, I think India should emphasize that the terror attack has to be condemned. And this is something that India has always been emphasizing, that there cannot be any soft peddling, any double standards on terrorism. And that stand should be mentioned clearly. Otherwise, later on, we can also be accused of not of asking for too much on terrorist attacks by countries on India.
I think that's a very important point, Suhasini, because there have been other moments when India has sought, for example, sanctions against groups like the Jamaat-ul-Dawa that have been then blocked by China. For Hamas not to find reference in that resolution, India would argue made it unpalatable to support. Yet the political opposition, led by Priyanka Gandhi, is arguing that India has missed a moral moment. Sharad Pawar is saying India is confused. It has betrayed the people of Palestine. There's been a fundamental shift in foreign policy. How do you see India's choice at the UN, Suhasini?
I don't see India's decision to abstain as particularly surprising, Barkha. I think India has become, in many ways, especially after the Ukraine war began, what I have often called an abstentionist power. That means you want a place at the high table, but eventually you find a way to abstain and really not have your vote counted in many ways. You've just mentioned twice, Barkha, that India's problem was that Hamas was not mentioned. I would like to point out to you that in the explanation of vote that you just played out, India does not mention Hamas either. India just says that it condemns the terror attacks in Israel. It condemns or is concerned about the civilian losses from the violence in Gaza. So India has not itself named Hamas in its own statement. The third point I'd like to make is really that it is possible, if India wanted to take a stand, to have voted, if it wanted to, voted for the resolution and put into its explanation of vote all the areas where it thought the resolution was found wanting. After all, India did vote for the Canadian amendment that added the condemnation of the terror attacks in Israel. But France, for example, has broken with its Western allies, has broken with the US and UK and other countries, and actually voted for the resolution. In its explanation of vote, the French representative said, we completely are for this resolution because we cannot condone the killing of civilians at any point of time, and there should be no hierarchy in the condemnation of the attacks on civilians, regardless of where they come from. And yet, France goes on to say here, 1, 2, 3 are the things that are missing from this vote. The final point being that if India wanted to make the point that the terror attacks against Israel are essentially, are an integral part of this resolution, well, India does have many choices if it wants to take a leadership position. India could have brought its own resolution or its own amendment into this, which would have perhaps brought others on board. India could have voted like the UK and the US for the resolution, against this resolution, and with Israel. Instead, I think what the government has chosen to do is something that we have seen several governments do, which is to abstain and stay away. I want to remind everyone, though, that in 2018, when there was an Israeli bombardment of Gaza of a similar sort, or perhaps a little less in those days, India did vote for a resolution asking for those attacks to stop.
But wasn't that a different context? Some might argue that...
Sure. I'm just saying that I'm just comparing India's votes right now to the votes we have seen India make over the last year on the Ukraine crisis, where when civilians were killed, when nuclear installations were in jeopardy, when we did see humanitarian access being stopped, even then the government chose to abstain when it was in the UN Security Council at the time. This time we're not even there.
So I think your point is that abstaining by itself is not the issue, but that those comments that did not mention Hamas, that did not explain why India was abstaining, that missed a moment.
India has a moment for leadership. If it chooses not to take that moment, it chooses to abstain, then it should say that we do want to abstain from this. I don't think any of the finessing or the explanation that Hamas was not mentioned in the UNGA resolution, and yet Hamas is not mentioned in our own explanation of vote, really cut much ice.
General Shukla, do you agree that two very different perspectives from the ambassador and Suhasini? Suhasini making the point that if the absence of the Hamas reference was the core reason for India moving from backing the resolution to abstaining, then Hamas should have been very pointedly named in those public remarks by the Indian representative. General Shukla?
Well, I think that was the purpose of the abstention. Since the video barbarism of 7th October was not condemned, Hamas was not mentioned, that is why we abstained. So I think, in terms of the finer nuancing, the ambassador and Suhasini may be right. But in terms of the broader play of justice, I think our response was just right. And if I may just, say so, apart from the resolution, we must very quickly examine why have we got to the sorry pass. And here, we must get back to the first principles, which are what? That how do we retain order in the international system? Well, the only way we can do that is that states must retain monopoly over violence and the instruments of force. Now, what is happening? Two things which are different this time. It's not that they've happened in the past, but perhaps they are more aggravated. One is that you are seeing that states are delegating these instruments of force to very powerful proxies, and we know who's doing that. And look at the Hezbollah; it's virtually like
So you
a
mean
second,
you mean Iran and the Hezbollah? Yes.
yeah, and see, it is a second strike instrument with Iran. 150,000 strong rocket arsenal from ranges from 20 kilometers to 700 kilometers, and political entities assuming the mantle of terror. The point is not, I mean, if Hamas is a revolutionary body, if it is political, that we have no quarrel with. The issue is, what did it do on 7th October? Their methods. And see, having executed these attacks of terror, let's be fair to the Israelis. What options do the Israelis have when heavily armed Hamas militants have embedded themselves in a non-combatant population? The calls have been going on for 7 to 10 days now that please get to the south of the Wadi line. And when military infra has been deliberately woven into mosques, into hospitals and residential apartments. Now, of course, it must not be vengeance, it must be justice. But in the military calibration of this, the Hamas also must be questioned. Because this is what are they doing? They are getting these civilians to get killed, and of course, then turning the cameras on them and causing all this outrage in the world, which is absolutely right. But the deceit and the sheer abandonment of all kinds of humanity on the part of Hamas and their procs and their mentors or handlers must also be called out.
I think that's a very fair point, but there's also a larger point of the redundancy of the United Nations. I mean, literally, what happened at the UN was Kartha running in parallel with the bombardment of Gaza. I mean, who's listening to the UN anyway? This is a landslide win. Clearly, there is an enfeebling of the United Nations now. Maybe it was always there. How did you see India's choice at the UN?
I think it was pretty well balanced, actually. I mean, I agree with what Suhasini is saying. Yeah, we didn't mention the word Hamas, but it's very, very clear our stance that there is zero tolerance for terrorism. And this is something which we've been opting for, we've been talking about for a long time. You can't have two positions on this, saying, oh, it's okay in one side and it's not okay in another. We are saying this is not justifiable under any circumstances. I mean, I think the exact wording I have, it says the world should not buy into justification of terror acts. So that is what our position is. Alongside, we've also said that we supported the two-state solution, calling for a sovereign, independent and viable state of Palestine. That is what our position is, and that is what we said. Also, see, just look at the resolution itself. It is entirely sort of towards one side, towards the Palestinians, talking of you must have access to humanitarian aid, you must have this, that and the other. And the title of the resolution, it is something which is, it doesn't mention hostages at all. So there's a lot that is wrong with this resolution, which to my mind brings to the fore the possibility, as you said, it was meant to be rejected all along. I mean, the phrasing is such that a bunch of countries would have rejected it, or as they did later, because of the sheer tragedy involved, they abstained, including, like we said, including Ukraine.
So according to you, India had no other good choices given the wording of the resolution?
No, we didn't. I don't think we could have. I mean, you just see even the title of the resolution, the fact that it doesn't mention hostages, that it's completely one-sided, it's not something that we can, when considering that over the years, this was not the case, say 10 years ago, but over the years, our stance on terrorism is completely clear. We are against terrorism for any reason whatsoever, and that is what is said.
So Hasni, let me bring you there. You took us back to a 2018 resolution, but that had no context of an attack of the kind that we saw by Hamas. There was a clip of a BBC interview that's gone viral where a Hamas representative is saying to the BBC reporter there was no instruction to kill civilians, and when confronted with the fact of the civilian killings, basically stops the interview. Why is there such a polarized this way or that way debate taking place? Isn't India's position encapsulating the commonsensical middle ground?
Well, to start with, many suppositions there. To begin with, I do believe Hamas is a terror group. I do believe what they carried out in Israel on the 7th of October
No, I
is
didn't mean you.
is a
That question was
terrorist
not
attack.
directed at
No,
you.
let me
That
finish.
question was not directed at you. That's all I was
Let
saying.
me
But go ahead.
finish.
Yeah.
I do believe, however, that states behave differently from terror groups, and that states are the ones that are held to account in the United Nations because states are members of the United Nations. And I think that all the case that has been made, if, for example, as Ms. Kartha says, the resolution was completely one-sided, then vote against it. My simple point is not to say one side or the other. My point is simply to say, if you're asking me what India's abstention meant, to me it means it signifies that India did not want to take a stand. Its stand is very clear in the explanation of vote that they condemn both sides. Wouldn't everybody actually say that the terror attacks are wrong? And wouldn't everybody actually say that the killing of civilians in retaliation for those terror attacks, and the numbers are just growing and growing, is wrong, particularly since those are being carried out by a state, not by a terror group? Is Hamas a member of the United Nations? No, but Israel is. So obviously, it is going to be a resolution that calls on a member state to stop the civilians bombing that we've seen, to stop, in the first 6 days after the attacks. The IDF itself put out figures. They stopped putting those out after, but they themselves put out figures to say that in 6 days, they had used 6,000 bombs, and you're showing the pictures there. 6,000 bombs on just that small area of northern Gaza. That's more than the united coalition of the US and others used on Raqqa against ISIS over a period of months, or in Afghanistan. So I'm just making the case here that we are not there urging, and in the United Nations, you do not urge terror groups to behave themselves. You urge states that are members of the United Nations to recall international humanitarian law, which India has pointed out again and again. But I do go back to the point that if India thinks it was important to name Hamas in the resolution, then India should have put Hamas into its own explanation of vote. And there must be a reason why it didn't, because we know, and Ambassador Sinha can tell you, that every word of an Indian statement is well weighed and well thought out.
I think that's a very, very fair question, Ambassador Sinha. If Hamas's absence in that resolution was the frontal reason, the main reason for us choosing to abstain, why haven't we been told that as a people? Why hasn't that been expressed at the United Nations?
Well, I agree partly with Suhasini on the point that in our explanation of vote, after the vote as was done, or probably before the vote, we should have mentioned Hamas, very clearly stated why we were not supporting the resolution. Now, here we must understand the difference between voting against and abstaining. You vote against the resolution if you disagree with the content of the resolution. Now, here we did not disagree with the content of the resolution. We disagreed with the fact that what was not contained in the resolution. And we supported the Canadian amendment seeking to add certain points that we wanted in the resolution, and that was defeated by a group of countries. That resolution amendment incidentally got the support of 88 countries, but 55 countries voted against it. And since the requirement was of 2/3 of those voting, that amendment was turned down. Now, since that amendment was turned down, India's position then became that if it still supported the resolution, then it would mean that we didn't support our amendment strongly enough. And if it voted against, then it meant that we were against the content of the resolution, which we were not. We are not objecting to what is there in the resolution. So our position was clearly stated, but it was not clearly enough stated. And there, I think, perhaps, I don't know why we didn't mention Hamas in that. Now, we must also mention, I disagree with you on one point. This resolution was not adopted by an overwhelming or a landslide majority. In fact, if the 45 members had voted against it, instead of abstaining, then the resolution would not have been adopted because it would not have met the requirement of 2/3 of those present and voting. Those abstaining were not counted in the UN system. Unlike in our system, those abstaining, their votes are not counted. So the 2/3 requirement was met because only I think 12 members of
Yeah.
14 members voted against it. So the support was of less than 2/3 of the total membership of the House. The 2/3 is 128.
Okay, fair point taken. But General Shukla, the point is that if Israel persists with this military approach, which at the moment it looks as if it will, those catastrophic casualty figures, though the American president has questioned them, has challenged them, but at the moment those are the figures we have to go by. And international agencies, from the UN to the World Health Organization to Doctors Without Borders, are seeming to validate those figures. And 2,900 children are dead. Now, I ask you to borrow from the Indian military's own responses, having to combat terrorism. There is such an emphasis on sparing civilian population. Do you believe that if Israel persists down this route, India will have to or should further calibrate its position, indeed as the world should?
No, see, let's first very honestly discuss Israel's position. Once it has been hit by those events of 7th October, does it have the right to respond? Does it have the right to self-defense? Now, the international laws of conflict, under what is called jus ad bellum, themselves say that you have the right to respond. The manner in which you respond have, in many countries, these issues have gone to courts of law. In Israel itself, it went through the Israeli Supreme Court in 2006, this whole business of targeted killings. And the Israeli Supreme Court said that within the realms of proportionality and the right to self-defense, Israel does, or these IDF does have the right to carry out these killings. Now, just let me say, look at the restraint. Israel is a professional army, so is our professional army. All these issues are put into a doctrine. They are in SOPs, they are in training manuals, they are institutionalized down the rank and file. You are constantly taught. You are mandated to ensure that there are no civilian casualties or that they are minimized. I'll give you an example. For example, if a pilot is coming over a target and he sees a busload of children, he aborts, he postpones. But here we are up against a very different situation where conceptually the Hamas is integrating civilians into their defense. Now, when conceptually they are doing it, it is Hamas who must be called out. When the civilized world is calling out they must be held to account. Justice, not vengeance. What President Biden said, don't make the mistakes of 9/11, proportionality, all that. Nobody knows it better than the IDF. But when the Hamas is doing what it is, which is, absolutely condemnable. So the questions, IDF must always be held to account, but the questions must be posed to Hamas. That's
before I come to Dr. Kartha, Suhasini, you were wanting to come in, and if you want to just pick up on the general's point there, those images that we're seeing of the bombing, the Israeli military is also alleging that hospitals, the Al-Shifa hospital in particular, they've released what they say are audio intercepts that they show that the Hamas is taking shelter in places like hospitals, and then later the Israeli military is accused of bombing those hospitals. How do you respond to the general's point that there has to be fair play, and there is no fair play if civilians are intermingled with terror groups that are sought to be dismantled?
I don't know. General Shukla himself said right now that if a bomber is about to drop a bomb on a target and a busload of children are there, then they do not. So the question is, if you know that the Al-Shifa hospital is, there's a warren underneath it which is full of Hamas terrorists, will you still go ahead and bomb the hospital or not? Now, that's a judgment call. And I suppose different countries will behave differently. I wanted to make a technical point. Ambassador Sinha said this vote would not have gone through had everyone who abstained voted against the resolution. That's not technically correct, because there were 59 who would have then voted against. 120 were still voting for, so the total was 180. So 2/3 would have been reached. But I do still want to make the point, Barkha, that if we are saying Hamas should be condemned and Hamas should be named in the resolution, then what stopped India from taking that leadership? If you are going to claim a place in the world, thinking you talk about being the Vishwa Guru, or about the world being one family and you being an integral part of it, then India should have led that amendment, or India should have had some kind of a resolution over there. But to say that my problem is that it doesn't include Hamas, but I don't have it in my explanation of vote, and that doesn't seem to upset anyone. I just want to ask the question: what was the point of the abstention? You may as well have been a not here vote. Also, to the other point that was being made, which is that India was unable to. India supported the Canadian amendment, which had asked for these additions, condemning the terror attacks by Hamas in Israel. The fact is, 88 countries voted for the Canadian. 88 countries voted for the Canadian amendment. And yet we still see that only 45 countries abstained and 14 countries voted against this resolution. So none of these numbers add up. What does add up is the idea that India did not decide. I mean, India decided not to take a side or to make any kind of a statement with its vote this time. I do want to point out that in the global south, most of the countries did vote in this 120. In South Asia, Bhutan, Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka, all of them voted for this resolution. Now, the idea that only India's position is somehow moralistic because they have taken this exceptional position, whereas a country like France, who voted for the resolution, put its objections into an explanation of vote, to me, it does beg a lot of questions. And I think those questions should be asked. Of what exactly is India's stand in this particular situation.
Dr. Kartha, respond to that. That there was a leadership moment missed, and that India, being in the unique position of actually having equations with both countries, a vastly improved equation with Israel, a historic set of ties with Palestine. The Palestinian ambassador to India repeatedly saying that India should play a larger role in this, and so Hasni making the point that instead of a larger role, we kind of diminished ourselves from taking a leadership position. What do you say to that, Kartha?
No, if I can just respond to something which was said earlier also by the general. See, you've been there, Barkha. You've seen the terrible state of affairs there, right? My biggest problem here with what Israel is doing, and I think I back Suhasini on this, bombing children, the rest of it is terrible. And the biggest point is it's operationally, it is very stupid. That is not what we do. When you have a terrorism strike, you take counter-terrorism action. You don't declare war and then have a siege. I mean, which kind of century are we living in? So my problem is with operationally, Israel is doing, in my opinion, they are going to make this 100 times worse. If they say Hamas was not being supported earlier, I'm pretty sure a year down the line, they'll have 100,000 more supporters. So that is one. Second issue is what you said again. The UN is, we know what it is, right? It's a political place where you make your stand. This resolution, as I said, was crafted in such a way that it was so heavily anti-Israel that it was very difficult for people to make a choice apart from India. For India, this is not it's a question of what we are very, very strong on the issue of terrorism. There is no watering that down. And what we said is not about Hamas terrorism only. We are saying terrorism in any guise. And that is...
Yes, but the context this time is Hamas. And if the absence of Hamas is the reason to abstain, then that should be put out there front and center in our own responses, is the point Suhasini is making.
I think ideally, perhaps, but I think the point which was made in our response is that it is very, very clear that terrorism for any reason whatsoever is not permissible. Also keeping in mind that a lot of people are saying, look, Hamas did this because the Palestine issue is so, which is true, which is a fact that Palestine issue is extremely tragic.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
Sorry.
you had I was just going to say you had the UN Secretary General also say what Hamas did was not in a vacuum. Those comments enraged Israel as well. But Ambassador Sinha, actually, before I come to the ambassador, I had an operational question of the general. The fact that Tara says Israel's military is being stupid, operationally, that you're entering a narrow strip of land where you know that there is a network of hundreds of kilometers of underground tunnels. And what are your military options in this scenario? Are you walking into some sort of ambush? Are you walking into a place where you are going to kill thousands and thousands of civilians? What are your military options at this point? I mean, I can't even imagine the Indian military making a choice like this.
I mean, see, for any military, this is a very difficult situation. And the military objectives will flow from the political directions. The strategic guidance is the elimination of Hamas, which means what? That you exterminate the top leaders, you take out the military infra, and you make sure that Hamas does not retain the options to strike again. Now, see, when you get down to nuancing it, a lot of things could be done. You look for critical nodes which you will target. It will lead, to tank-led infantry assaults. And of course, these assaults will be bloody. 2006 itself, Israel suffered a bloody nose at the hands of the Hezbollah. All kinds of things will come into play, attack hectors, artillery, so on and so forth. But I'm very sure nobody knows it better than the Israeli military that targeting of these civilians will not help. Now, what is being done at this point, airstrikes and all, is from a distance. You don't know what kind of, faking is going around. For example, I mean, I'm not saying that it has happened, but there is every possibility. The other real issue is that for 10 days now, I mean, what can militaries do to reduce collateral damage? They will appeal to you. They are broadcasting that please move women and children out. Why is the Hamas not doing that? If Hamas doesn't do that, this is going to happen. I'm not justifying it in any manner, and I agree entirely with Tara that if there are more civilian casualties than there should be, the military operation will be rendered useless. We know 2006, what Elmad Omar said, half of Lebanon destroyed and yet a loss. I mean, there is every danger of that repeating itself. But given what has happened in 7th October, the IDF in relation to the political directions has some very bad options, and it is doing its best in very difficult circumstances.
Before I come to the ambassador, Suhasini, my question to you would be: if we agree that a country has the right to retaliate to a terror attack of the kind Hamas inflicted, then I think General Shukla makes the point that there are no good options. There are no good options here for Israel, and certainly not for Gaza.
Absolutely. And I think the US President Biden said himself that we made bad choices when we retaliated against 9/11 the way we did. So the idea being, yes, certainly you do have to take the best option in terms of finding those responsible for the attacks on you. The question over here, Barkha, is very different. It is about Israel's decision to say within a few hours that our response is going to be clear out this entire place of this entire area of Gaza, flatten it completely. And we've seen some of the visuals. I am not able to to verify exactly how much of Gaza has already been flattened, but I did see some figures of approximately between 9 to 15,000 to 20,000 buildings being flattened. It means 200,000 people already don't have homes to go back to. The idea that this is the only option or this is the best of all the options, to me, boggles the mind. But beyond that, I do want to ask the question, should a state behave as a terror group does, which is not distinguishing between civilians, so long as they are able to get to their objectives? I think that is the question that was being asked. By all means, there should be a UN resolution talking about the terror attacks on Israel. Why hasn't anyone brought that out yet? Why hasn't anyone sponsored a resolution on it yet? But the question remains, is Israel's reaction today, and now we're talking 3 weeks, Barkha, we're not talking about Israel's immediate reaction and a massive bomb that went off. We're talking about consistent pounding for 21 days of an area that is, as you know, a very tiny 40 something square kilometers by 46 kilometers by 10 kilometers or so. Now, when you're talking about that kind of operation, in 2018, you said, okay, there's no comparison, but the resolution at that point had spoken about excessive force by Israel. In those days, Israel was reacting to rocket attacks that had targeted Israeli cities. If you were talking about excessive force there, I think that's what's being discussed in this situation. And regardless of everything else, I do want to make the point that in a situation like this, India really had several choices. And I think India decided to take the safest choice rather than actually having an opinion that counted over there. I totally agree that on terrorism, we have zero tolerance. And yet, I do ask the question, well, then put that into the resolution or put it into your explanation of vote, but have that ability to say that this is a resolution that is trying to stop something that is happening right now. And you've already given the figures of the numbers that have died. It really does amaze me that anyone would say that this is the best of all the options Israel has today.
Ambassador Sinha, let me give you the last word. We already see some sort of calibration in the Indian position. It started off with the Prime Minister personally, unequivocally, in the immediate aftermath of the terror attack, showing the solidarity with Israel that I think much of the country said was the right and the appropriate sort of sentiment. But then you had the government, the foreign ministry, issuing a much more granular response, invoking India's historical position on the two-state solution. Do you think India can afford to hang on to what Suhasini calls the very safe response if civilian casualties continue to mount in the way that they clearly are going to if Israel persists with this approach? And I take the general's point, I take Tara Kartha's point that for a country looking to dismantle the Hamas, there are no good options. But is this the best option, and how does India calibrate accordingly?
Well, first of all, I must thank Suhasini for doing her math very quickly. Yes, if the 45 countries had voted against, it would still have passed because that would have required 119 votes, and it got 120 votes. But 14 countries did not participate in the vote. So two-thirds majority in General Assembly is 128. So it wasn't a landslide vote in favor of the resolution. That was the point I was trying to make.
Fair.
On this issue of what should our stand be, our stand is quite clear. We are against terrorism. We condemn the terrorist attack, but we feel that, but we support the two-state solution. Now, this Holy Land is a center for holy wars, and it's a very difficult place. And very few countries have a clear policy on how to deal with this matter. It's been going on for the last 70 years. Our position earlier, at one time, we didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel. Then later on, we started having diplomatic relations. It's a very difficult place. We must keep in mind that the Palestinian Authority is a member of the OIC. And every year, the OIC adopts resolutions against India. But we have not held that against the Palestinian Authority, that they sit in a conference and pass resolutions against India, condemning us of genocide in Kashmir and other places. So we have balanced our stand. We have taken into account the fact that Israel at times responds very, very in a violent way, perhaps not in accordance with international law, but so does the Palestinian Authority, so does Hamas. The PLO was at one time a terrorist organization. This is a very difficult place. And we have to tread a very difficult balanced line where we support the cause of the Palestinians, and yet Israel is a friend, and Israel has the right to exist, right to defend itself. Exactly how it defends itself is we have to leave it to the Israelis. We did not counterattack Pakistan when Mumbai took place. That's our philosophy, that's our policy. But not all countries believe in our policy of not hitting back when you are hit.
Yeah.
So there we stand.
General, you wanted to come in? Yeah, go ahead, General Shukla.
Yeah, we must also ask those that planned this attack and their mentors, what exactly did they expect Israel and the IDF to do by way of response once they committed that savagery of 7th October? What did they expect in return? The second point that I would like to make is that, you see, today we are into airstrikes. When the ground invasion unfolds, the number of casualties on the Palestinian side will decrease, and the casualties on the IDF side will increase. That is what happens when ground invasions go.
Absolutely, yes.
Perhaps the narrative will change. The third point, what the ambassador mentioned, as long as we didn't attack Pakistan, every day in India, a bomb went through, and we explained it away by saying India was a raucous democracy. When we demonstrated new normals in our strategic outlook by doing Balakot, these attacks have stopped. So there are consequences either way. I mean, you can continue to indulge in debate, and sometimes legitimate debate, or you act. And once you act, there are some advantages, some disadvantages. There's also the advantages, disadvantages are associated with inaction.
Yeah, let me pick up the last point and give it to Tara and Suhasini. Tara, to you first. That what did the Hamas expect would happen?
They expected exactly what happened, that they would bombard them. And now the Hamas or Palestine has got their issue has come right on top of the international agenda. And this is at a time when the peace process was going on, right? And that was the whole point. They thought they'd be ignored. Saudi Arabia and Israel make up, everything is hunky-dory, and Palestine gets a tiny little bit somewhere. Now that is done.
I think General Shukla wants to come in for one brief interjection, and I'll let you complete your point.
One very brief. I mean, just responding to what Tara said. Now, see, this is exactly where Netanyahu's right-wing politics went wrong, because he thought that Palestine is just the appendage to the larger Israel story, and even the Arab world got it wrong. Abraham Accords and so on. So I think, if I may just sum up with two things, just 1 minute, Barkha. One is, Suhasini may be right with regard to the nuancing of this UN resolution, but the broad Indian stance has been consistent. We've condemned terror. We've tried to distinguish Hamas and Palestine, and we have said that the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians must be. And if I may, just one quick point I want to make. I would want to recall the words of Edward Wilson. It may sound a little philosophical, but they are very pertinent. He says, see, what is confounding humanity today? Stone Age emotions, what we saw on 7th October, medieval institutions, Anthony Guterres, Secretary General, standing for days at the Rafah crossing and nothing happening, and godlike technologies which are happening in this warfare. So, this quibbling about resolutions and all is fine. I would want to return to my initial point that the state of the international system has to be re-examined regarding who will have monopoly over instruments of violence and force.
I'm glad you brought up Netanyahu, though, because Tara, the one thing I do come back with is the overwhelming contempt that literally every Israeli I met has for the prime minister, accusing him actually of having strengthened the Hamas and weakened the more moderate Palestinian Authority because it suited completely his right-wing politics. So that point also has to be made, that Hamas is not Palestine, but Netanyahu is not Israel. But do go ahead, Ms. Kartha, and make your point.
The point I was making is that, see, the UN is a political forum, and who sponsored the resolution? A bunch of states who will never take refugees. So they got their pound of flesh by making a resolution. That's it. They said, oh, we are these fantastic people. We've got and they're done. That is the basic line. They put this resolution and it's come all on the paper, the Arab states of Palestine. But what does it matter on the ground? Nothing. So when Suhasini says that we should take a stand, for what? I mean, I will take a stand which is based on my national interest. And my national interest is against terrorism. But we also support the Palestinians because that is a humanitarian thing. That is how the UN works. This is not about grandstanding.
So, Hasani, before you respond to that question about refugees is a very important one, because when you contrast it to Russia, Ukraine, you literally had countries in the West ordinary folks opening their doors to Ukrainian refugees. Jordan, Egypt are not going to let one Palestinian from Gaza in. Tara's somewhat cold-blooded question is, what's in it for India to take a stand this way or that way, beyond this? So, Hasani.
Certainly, let India not take a stand then. then let's not stand on any great principles of anything. Because India has taken stands in the past. So we can't say that we only stand for our national interest. I'm just saying that in this case, we have chosen not to. And that is in the hands of whoever leads the country. As far as the refugees go, there are two parts to this question. One, I think Tara is forgetting that Jordan, who actually proposed this resolution, has 2 million Palestinian refugees registered inside its country. Other countries have taken refugees in the past. But the second point to that is that there is a fear that by accepting refugees, essentially, you are making it easier for Israel to take over some of those territories. Now, Israel may say, we have no intention of taking these territories. We're just trying to defeat Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and that's about it. And then we leave. We left once before in 2006. We have no intention of staying there. But I do have to ask again, when you completely flatten an area, all the housing is gone. You completely take away any kind of, fuel, water, electricity, broadband, internet, everything from that area. And then you have these refugees building up. The obvious next step is going to be that the refugees have to go away somewhere and perhaps never return. Why is Jordan taking that stand? Perhaps because they have 2 million Palestinian refugees who have never been able. I mean, the whole idea of taking refugees is that it's a temporary measure, and that when there is a cessation of hostilities, they'll be able to go back. In this situation, these countries would then be culpable, and I don't use that word easily, but they would be culpable in allowing this kind of cleansing out of Gaza, taking the refugees in their countries, and then allowing Israel to repopulate Gaza as it so desires. So that is the fear. I'm not saying that that is what Israel is going to do. I'm saying that is the fear when you talk about this refugee situation. And let's not forget there are refugees being taken and have been taken over decades in many of these countries.
Okay, Ambassador Sinha, the closing word to you. Do you see any possibility of a ceasefire if Hamas were to release hostages? Hamas has argued, and I'm not drawing equivalence between a terror group and the Israeli military, but Hamas claims that they offered to release civilians, but Israel didn't receive them back. I don't know. Now, a lot of allegations are lost in the fog of war. Do you believe that there is any country with the clout right now to restrain Israel, but also influence the Hamas to release 222 hostages?
Well, I think Hamas should release the hostages. Whether they will or not, I don't know. And Israel should accept them, because Israel should realize that public memory is extremely short. The attack of October 7 is in the memory right now, but very soon that will fade, and what will remain in the memory of people is the attacks that take place on Gaza. So this public sympathy will slowly move towards the civilians in Gaza. Now, as far as influence is concerned, well, the US has restrained Israel to a certain extent from going in. Perhaps also the fear that they'll lose very heavily if they enter on ground. And I think a country like Qatar, which has been hosting the Hamas for a long time and supports Hamas, can play a prominent role in this. The very fact that 2 Americans and 2 other hostages have been released unharmed means that it is possible to get a settlement on this. And I think that's what Israel should settle for at the moment, and look for a longer-term strategy to counter this problem. Israel's policy of occupying and trying to get into the West Bank and taking over Palestinian territory is not the wisest policy they've been following, but that's Netanyahu for you, his right-wing supporters. So that mess continues. We don't know what the solution is.
And if what you're saying doesn't happen, then this is an expanding conflict. If it pulls in Iran, the United States cannot sit out. So the stakes are pretty high for the entire world. And I think General Shukla raised a very interesting point. How does the United Nations or global bodies respond when proxies are at play, something that India has experienced? We leave it there, an extremely complex set of questions before the world. Thank you to Suhasini Haidar, Tara Kartha, General Raj Shukla, and Ambassador Sinha, and to our audience. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.